The HOA president literally screamed that my legally purchased cabin was her son's inheritance. What she didn't know? I'd already found the 1873 land grant proving I owned half the valley, and her family had been squatting illegally for 50 years. Picture this. I'm chainsawing rotted boards off my beautiful 150-year-old cabin when this white Mercedes screeches up my dirt road. Out storms Delilah Thornwick, 50-something, blonde highlights, face red as a steamed crab. "Stop! You're destroying Bradley's birthright!" I kill the chainsaw engine. The sudden silence hung thick, broken only by her ragged breathing and the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine drifting between us. "Lady, I bought this place fair and square." "Fair and square?" She actually laughed. "Some county auction doesn't erase a century of family history." Poor Delilah. She had no idea that basement document would cost her everything. "What would you do if some entitled Karen tried stealing your property?" "Drop your location below. Bet your town's got similar horror stories. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. My name's Marcus Holloway, I'm 45, and 6 months ago my life imploded spectacularly. 20-year marriage? Gone. Suburban dream house? Sold to pay divorce lawyers who charge more per hour than I made in a day. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes it's exactly where you find your footing. My grandfather, rest his soul, always said, 'Marcus, work with your hands and you'll never starve.' He'd taught me carpentry when I was 12, showed me how to read wood grain like scripture. When he passed, he left me his tools and $37,000 with a note, 'Build something that matters.' So there I was, scrolling county auction listings at 2 a.m. when I found her. This gorgeous 1873 log cabin estate on 15 acres in Millbrook Valley, population 847, where old money meets new McMansions in an uncomfortable stare-down. The photo showed original chestnut logs and stone foundation, but clearly neglected. The musty smell of century-old timber hit me during the preview walkthrough. These weren't just logs, they were hand-hewn beams thick as my waist, fitted with craftsmanship you can't buy anymore. I ran my calloused fingers along those rough surfaces and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, pure possibility. Auction day was beautiful chaos. My $47,000 beat out some preppy kid in a BMW who kept texting frantically, probably begging mommy for more money. Clean title, verified paperwork, done deal. That's when Hurricane Delilah entered my life. Day 3 of renovation. I'm replacing rotted porch boards when this pristine white Escalade comes crunching up my gravel drive like it owned the place. Out steps perfection in designer jeans. Blonde highlights, manicured nails, expression like she'd stepped in something unpleasant. "Excuse me," she said, voice dripping honey over broken glass. "I'm Delilah Thornwick, president of the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association. My husband Dean owns Thornwick Construction. Perhaps you've heard of us?" Ah, local royalty. That explained the attitude. I wiped sawdust off my flannel. "Marcus Holloway, what can I help you with?" Her smile could have cut diamonds. "Well, Marcus, this property has complications. You see, it's always been understood that this land was reserved for the Thornwick family. My son Bradley had an understanding with Mr. Henderson." "What kind of understanding?" "A gentleman's agreement. Bradley was inheriting this property. It's been in our family's sphere of influence for generations." She said "our family," like announcing nobility. I pulled out my deed. "Ma'am, according to the county, Henderson died without heirs. That's why it went to auction." The mask slipped. Her country club smile vanished like smoke. "That auction was premature," she said coldly. "This property belongs with people who understand its significance, people who appreciate community standards." The way she said community standards while eyeing my work boots made my skin crawl. I'd heard that tone before, usually from supervisors explaining why blue-collar guys weren't management material. "Look, I understand you're disappointed, but I bought this legally. I'm not going anywhere." She pulled out her phone, tapped something quickly. "We'll see about that," she muttered, then clicked toward her SUV, heels tapping an angry rhythm on my stone walkway. Before climbing in, she turned back with that predatory smile. "Mr. Holloway, you clearly don't understand how Millbrook Valley works. We have standards here. I suggest you learn them quickly, or you'll find permits very difficult to obtain." The Escalade roared away, kicking up dust that coated everything. As I watched those taillights disappear, the afternoon air carried the distant hum of expensive lawnmowers and the lingering scent of her overpriced perfume. I should have known right then that Delilah Thornwick wasn't just upset about losing property. She was declaring war on someone she considered beneath her station. Big mistake, lady. I'd been fighting uphill battles my whole life. Turns out Delilah wasn't bluffing about those permits. Week 2 started with a phone call that made my coffee taste like ash. Mr. Holloway, this is Janet from the county building department. We seem to have misplaced your renovation permits. Misplaced. Right, like paperwork just grows legs and walks away. I drove to the county office where Janet, a nervous woman who wouldn't make eye contact, explained that my permits had been accidentally deleted during a routine computer update. She handed me a stack of forms thicker than a small-town phone book, the paper still warm from the printer. This'll take weeks to process, I said. Sorry, protocol. She glanced toward the back office where I could see someone's shadow moving behind frosted glass. 2 days later, while I was reorganizing my tools and cursing bureaucracy, a building inspector showed up unannounced. Frank Morrison, 40-something guy with a clipboard and the personality of wet concrete. Got complaints about unauthorized work, he said, boots crunching across my gravel drive like he was marching to war. What unauthorized work? I stopped everything when your office called. He walked my property like he was hunting violations with a metal detector. The sweet scent of sawdust still hung in the morning air from my last day of legal work, mixing with the earthy smell of October leaves and the faint diesel exhaust from his truck. Finally, he scribbled something and handed me a citation. Historical structure modifications without heritage approval. Improper waste disposal. He pointed at my burn pile. 2,300 in fines. Work stoppage order effective immediately. My blood pressure spiked. That's seasoned timber. I checked the burning regulations. Anonymous complaint says otherwise. He shrugged and walked away, leaving me standing there like I'd been sucker punched. That's when I remembered something my grandfather used to say. When someone's cheating, they're probably breaking their own rules too. Time to hit the books. The county archives smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams. I spent 3 hours digging through dusty records, my fingers getting black with decades-old ink stains. What I found made me laugh out loud, earning a sharp shush from the librarian who looked like she'd been cataloging since the Civil War. My cabin, built 1873. Millbrook Valley's first zoning laws. Established 1962. Nearly a century difference. I'd read enough legal documents during my divorce to know what this meant, but I needed professional confirmation. Eleanor Vasquez's law office was above Bob's Hardware, accessed by stairs that announced every visitor with theatrical creaks. Eleanor was 70-something, sharp as her letter opener, with silver hair and eyes that could spot bullshit from 3 counties away. Grandfathered structures, she said, reviewing my paperwork. Your cabin predates modern zoning by 90 years. They can't retroactively regulate what was perfectly legal when it was built. She smiled like a poker player holding aces. I learned this principle the hard way when developers tried pushing out my grandmother's farmhouse back in '78. Pre-existing structures have constitutional protections that most people never think to research. What about the fines? We'll contest every one. But Marcus, this isn't about permits. She pulled out a thick file that landed on her desk with a thud that made her coffee cup rattle. I've seen this exact pattern before. The file contained 8 similar cases. All newcomers, all blue-collar, all harassed until they gave up and left. Each story started with mysterious permit problems and escalated to pure hell. She's running a protection racket, Eleanor said quietly. Document everything, and whatever you do, don't let her win. I drove home feeling armed with knowledge, but the victory lasted about 5 minutes. Delilah's white Escalade sat at my property line like a predator waiting for wounded prey. She stood there with a professional camera, photographing my work site like she was documenting a crime scene. Beautiful evening, she called out sweetly. Just documenting some maintenance concerns. I pulled out my phone and started recording. What kind of concerns? Property standards issues. We take community values very seriously. Click, click, click went her camera, each flash like a small lightning strike. Wouldn't want any undesirable elements affecting neighborhood property values. That word again. Undesirable. Like I was some kind of invasive species threatening her ecosystem. Mrs. Thornwick, this property isn't part of your HOA jurisdiction. Her smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered behind those perfectly made-up eyes. Everything in Millbrook Valley affects our community, Marcus. Everything. She climbed back into her SUV, then rolled down the window. Oh, and I'd be very careful about that burn pile. The fire department takes safety violations seriously, especially after anonymous tips. As her taillights disappeared into the gathering dusk, I stood there breathing in the evening air, wood smoke, autumn leaves, and the lingering scent of her expensive perfume mixing into something that smelled like trouble. This wasn't about permits anymore. This was war. Week 3 brought a new level of crazy I hadn't seen since my ex-wife tried to claim my grandfather's tools as marital assets. The Millbrook Valley Community Center buzzed with tension Tuesday night. I wasn't invited to the emergency HOA meeting, but Eleanor suggested I crash the party anyway. Public meetings, public property, she'd said with that shark smile. I slipped in through the back door as Delilah was setting up a PowerPoint presentation. The room smelled like burnt coffee and middle-class anxiety, with about 30 residents scattered across folding chairs that squeaked like tortured mice every time someone shifted nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen," Delilah began, clicking to a slide titled "Property Value Threats in Our Community." Her voice carried that fake sweetness that could give you diabetes. "We have a situation requiring immediate action." Click. A photo of my cabin appeared, shot from the worst possible angle to make it look like a meth lab. "This project threatens everything we've built here. Unregulated construction, fire hazards, and frankly, the kind of transient housing operation that attracts criminal elements." Transient housing? Lady, I was restoring Abe Lincoln's childhood home compared to these cookie-cutter McMansions. Click. Another slide. Proposed special assessment. $500 per household to fund legal protection of community standards. The room erupted. $500 to fight me? These people were getting fleeced, but half were nodding along like she'd just quoted scripture. That's when Mrs. Henderson, 80-something widow in the front row, raised a shaky hand. "Excuse me, dear, but wasn't that cabin built by the original settlers? Shouldn't we be preserving our actual history?" Delilah's smile could have cracked glass. "Mrs. Henderson, we appreciate your vintage perspective, but historical sentiment doesn't override modern safety concerns." I'd heard enough. I stood up from the back, and every head turned like I'd just announced I had leprosy. "Since you're discussing my property," I said, walking forward through air thick enough to cut, "maybe I should clarify a few things." Delilah's face cycled through more colors than a traffic light malfunction. "This is a private HOA meeting," she stammered. "Posted as public notice," I replied, showing the community website on my phone. My attorney confirmed my right to attend. That's when Eleanor herself walked in, briefcase in hand and timing so perfect it seemed choreographed. The woman had flair. "Good evening, everyone," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I believe there's been some confusion about legal jurisdiction here." She opened her briefcase with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. "I've researched this HOA's incorporation documents. Fascinating reading." She held up the founding papers. "According to these filings, Mr. Holloway's property was never legally included in Millbrook Estates' HOA jurisdiction." The room went dead silent except for the fluorescent lights humming overhead like angry wasps. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, savoring every word, "the previous property owner, Mr. Henderson, was illegally charged HOA dues for 17 years. This organization has been collecting fees from someone who was never actually a member." Bradley Thornwick shot up from his chair like someone had electrocuted him. "That's impossible. My family has managed this community for decades." "Managed, yes," Eleanor said mildly. "Legally governed? Different story entirely." I watched Delilah's master plan implode in real time. Her PowerPoint presentation had just become evidence of harassment, and the realization was written across her face in permanent marker. "This is targeted harassment," she said, voice shaking like autumn leaves. "I'll be filing complaints with the State Bar Association." "Please do," Eleanor replied smoothly. "I'll save you the research time on my 30-year track record fighting exactly this kind of municipal overreach." The meeting dissolved into beautiful chaos. Neighbors arguing, questions flying, and Delilah packing up her laptop like the building was about to collapse. As people filed out, I caught fragments of conversation that sounded surprisingly supportive. Bob Kettering stopped by my chair, the scent of hardware store oil still clinging to his work shirt. "Hell of a show," he said quietly. "Been waiting years for someone to stand up to that woman." "Count me in if you need community support," added Martha Caldwell, the retired teacher whose eyes sparkled with rebellious joy. Outside in the parking lot, Delilah cornered me by my truck. The October air was sharp enough to sting your lungs, and her breath came out in angry puffs like a steam engine. "You think you're clever," she hissed, "but you have no idea what you're dealing with. My family built this community. We know every county commissioner, every state legislator, every business owner who matters." "Must be nice having connections," I said, climbing into my truck. "Too bad none of them can redraw legal property lines." As I drove home through the crisp night air, tasting victory mixed with the distant scent of someone's fireplace, I felt like David after nailing Goliath right between the eyes. That feeling lasted exactly 12 hours. Wednesday morning brought the melodious sound of heavy machinery at 6 a.m., followed by my water pressure dropping to what I can only describe as geriatric garden hose. I stumbled outside in my work boots and bathrobe to find a Thornwick construction crew repairing the main water line along my property boundary. Dean Thornwick himself stood there in a pristine hard hat, supervising like he was orchestrating the D-Day invasion instead of supposedly fixing a pipe that had worked perfectly fine yesterday. "Morning, Marcus," he called out with the fake cheerfulness of a used car salesman. "Sorry about the early start. Emergency water main repair. Should have you back to normal pressure by, Friday maybe? Friday. Just long enough to make restoration work impossible for the rest of the week." These people had the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. "Funny how these emergencies always happen on my property line," I said, watching his crew work with the practiced efficiency of people who'd choreographed this dance before. Dean shrugged, hard hat gleaming in the morning sun. "Infrastructure's old around here. Things break when you least expect it." By noon, I'd lost 3 supplier relationships faster than a politician loses promises after Election Day. Bob's hardware was still solid, but the lumberyard, electrical supply, and plumbing distributor all called with variations of the same rehearsed script. "Sorry, Marcus, but we're experiencing delivery issues in your area." Delivery issues. In a town of 847 people where you could spit from Main Street to the county line. The afternoon brought my insurance agent, looking like he'd rather be getting a colonoscopy with a rusty coat hanger. "Marcus, we've received anonymous reports about safety violations on your property. Fire hazards, structural concerns, environmental issues." "What specific violations?" He scrolled through his tablet, the screen reflecting off his nervous sweat. "Open burn piles near structures, unpermitted electrical work, foundation modifications without engineering approval." He looked up apologetically. "We'll need to send an inspector. Until then, your coverage is suspended." Suspended, so if my cabin mysteriously caught fire, I'd be holding the bag. How convenient. That evening, I installed security cameras around my property, basic motion-activated units from Bob's store. I was testing the night vision when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Marcus, Police Chief Rita Gonzalez. We need to talk." 30 minutes later, Chief Gonzalez sat in my kitchen, declining coffee and radiating the kind of discomfort usually reserved for root canal patients. Mid-40s, professional, with tired eyes that had seen too much small-town bullshit. "I'll be straight with you," she said, the smell of her patrol car's diesel exhaust still clinging to her uniform. "I've been getting pressure to investigate complaints about your property, noise violations, environmental concerns, suspicious activity." "What kind of suspicious activity?" "The reports are deliberately vague, but Marcus, I've been wearing this badge for 15 years. I know organized harassment when I see it." She leaned forward, voice dropping. "Document everything. Times, dates, witnesses, and watch your back." After she left, I sat on my porch in the cricket-filled darkness, listening to the distant hum of overpriced air conditioning units cooling overpriced houses. The sweet scent of honeysuckle drifted on the evening breeze, mixing with lingering diesel fumes and the faint smell of my own anger. That's when I noticed the slow-rolling car. Then again, and again. The 4th pass, I was ready with my phone camera. Bradley Thornwick's BMW crawled past at about 5 miles per hour, interior light blazing, so I could see him photographing my property like some discount private investigator. The kid had all the stealth skills of a marching band. Friday morning brought my water pressure back, along with a business card tucked under my windshield wiper like a passive-aggressive love note. "Thornwick Construction, we buy properties fast, cash offers." The sheer audacity made me laugh out loud. I was photographing the card for evidence when Bob Kettering's pickup truck came crunching up my gravel drive. He climbed out carrying a thermos that smelled like salvation and wearing an expression like someone had run over his favorite hunting dog. "We need to talk," he said, voice tight as a guitar string. Inside my kitchen, Bob poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "Dean Thornwick paid me a visit yesterday. Made it crystal clear that my business depends on maintaining good community relationships." He looked up with eyes full of shame and fury. "He's cutting off my supplier credit if I keep helping you." "Bob, you don't have to—" "Like hell I don't." His voice gained strength like an engine warming up. 30 years I've been in this town, and I won't be bullied by some trust fund prince and his psycho wife." He pulled out a manila envelope thick with secrets. "Besides, I found something you need to see. Inside were photocopies of building permits going back 5 years. All Thornwick construction projects, all approved in record time. Notice anything about those approval dates? Bob asked. Every single permit bore the signature of Frank Morrison, the same inspector who'd cited me for imaginary violations. Same guy, same rubber stamp, same rigged game. Sweet Jesus, I whispered. They've got the whole system bought and paid for. Saturday morning, I was down in the basement wrestling with a sagging floor joist when my crowbar punched through what I thought was solid stone foundation. Instead of the satisfying thunk of metal on rock, I heard a hollow echo that made my stomach flip like I'd just found buried treasure, which, as it turned out, I had. Behind that loose stone was a cavity about the size of a shoebox, and inside sat a leather-wrapped bundle that looked like it had been waiting since Abraham Lincoln was splitting rails. I carried it upstairs with hands shaking worse than a first-time skydiver. The leather was cracked but intact, bound with rawhide strips that felt like touching history itself. The whole thing smelled like old paper, leather oil, and secrets that had been fermenting for 150 years. Inside were documents that made my knees buckle. The first was an official territorial land grant dated September 15th, 1873. Signed by the territorial governor himself, sealed with red wax that had somehow survived in that stone time capsule. The paper was thick as cardboard, official as a Supreme Court ruling, and absolutely authentic looking. But it was the name that made me sit down hard on my kitchen floor. Granted to Ezekiel Holloway and his heirs in perpetuity. Holloway. My family name. Holy shit. The land description was written in that flowery 19th century lawyer language that takes 20 words to say what normal people say in 5. But the boundaries were crystal clear, starting from the great oak by the creek bend and extending 50 acres north to the ridge line, encompassing timber rights, mineral rights, and water rights in perpetuity. 50 acres. Not the 15 I'd bought at auction. 50 acres that included pretty much the entire valley floor where Delilah's precious McMansion kingdom now squatted like a tick on a dog's back. The second document was a hand-drawn map that looked like it was sketched by someone who actually knew how to survey land. According to this beauty, the Thornwick family's ancestral home was built dead center on property that had belonged to my great-great-grandfather. Talk about ironic justice. The third document was a letter written in faded ink but still legible. To my descendants, should any man challenge our rightful claim to this land, present these papers to the territorial authority. This grant supersedes all lesser claims and cannot be diminished by local ordinance or later settlement. Ezekiel Holloway had been one paranoid, brilliant old coot. I spread everything out on my kitchen table like I was planning a military campaign. The implications hit me like a freight train loaded with dynamite. Delilah's family hadn't just been squatting for 50 years. They'd been illegally occupying my family's land for a century and a half. Every house in their development, every lot they'd sold, every property tax they'd collected, all of it on land that technically belonged to me. But here's what really made my heart race: the mineral rights. According to the grant, those came with the territory. I'd heard whispers about natural gas deposits in these hills, maybe even rare earth minerals. If those rumors were true, I wasn't just looking at property ownership. I was looking at wealth that would make the Thornwick construction empire look like a kid's lemonade stand. I called Eleanor with fingers that could barely dial. "You need to get over here now," I said, "and bring someone who can authenticate historical documents." What did you find? The nuclear option. An hour later, Eleanor sat in my kitchen with Dr. Patricia Morse from the State Historical Society. Dr. Morse examined the documents with scientific precision, checking paper composition, ink characteristics, even scraping a microscopic sample of the wax seal. "Preliminary assessment?" Eleanor asked, barely containing her excitement. Dr. Morse looked up with eyes bright as Vegas neon. "These appear authentic. If verified, this territorial land grant would supersede any modern property claims." Eleanor's shark smile could have powered the whole valley. "Marcus, you don't just own this cabin. You own half of Millbrook Valley." Checkmate, Delilah. Sunday morning turned my kitchen into a war room that would have made General Patton weep with envy. Eleanor arrived first, carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than my annual truck payments and wearing the expression of a shark who'd just discovered the opposing legal team was actually a school of goldfish. Dr. Morse followed with a portable document authentication kit that looked like something Q would give James Bond. "First priority," Eleanor announced, spreading legal pads across my table like battle maps. "Professional authentication, complete title research, and geological survey. We're not just fighting for property rights anymore. We're potentially overturning an entire fraudulent development." Bob Kettering showed up with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and Martha Caldwell, who'd apparently been doing homework since our HOA meeting. "Figured you could use some community backup," Bob said, setting down a thermos that smelled like liquid justice. Martha pulled out a folder thick as a dictionary. "I've been researching your family tree, Marcus. Ezekiel Holloway was quite the character. Civil War veteran, territorial surveyor, and apparently paranoid enough to hide documents where they'd survived the apocalypse." She grinned like a kid with a secret. "Also found his original surveyor's notes at the county museum." "Want to guess what they say about mineral deposits?" The kitchen filled with organized chaos, papers shuffling, phones ringing, and the occasional sweet mother of pearl when someone discovered another smoking gun. Dr. Morse worked with scientific precision, photographing every document under specialized lighting. "Paper composition matches 1870s territorial government stock perfectly," she said, adjusting equipment that probably cost more than my cabin. "Ink shows proper aging characteristics, and this wax seal, this is genuine period material with embedded territorial office fibers." I made mental notes as she explained document authentication techniques. Back in my divorce, I'd learned that original documents always trump copies in court, a lesson that was about to pay massive dividends. Eleanor was already neck-deep in her legal network. "Patricia, I need complete land records for Millbrook County going back to 1870. Yes, I know it's Sunday. Oh. Because my client just found the legal equivalent of finding oil in his backyard. While the professionals worked their magic, I called Police Chief Gonzalez. She answered before the second ring, like she'd been waiting. "Chief, it's Marcus. I need to report some findings that might interest your investigation." "What kind of findings?" "The kind that explain why certain people have been absolutely desperate to drive me off this property." An hour later, Chief Gonzalez sat reviewing Bob's permit corruption evidence, her jaw getting tighter with each page. The sound of papers being turned was punctuated by her increasingly creative profanity. "This is systematic official misconduct," she said finally. "Frank Morrison's been fast-tracking Thornwick projects while sabotaging everyone else. Federal conspiracy charges if we can prove coordination. Here's something I'd learned during my corporate days. Document everything with timestamps, because pattern evidence is what wins in court. One incident looks like coincidence, but 8 identical harassment campaigns? That's a prosecutable conspiracy." By noon, we had a 3-phase battle plan that felt like something out of a legal thriller. Eleanor would file quiet title action to establish my full property boundaries. Dr. Morse would expedite authentication through state archives using her academic connections. Chief Gonzalez would launch an official corruption investigation with federal oversight. But the stroke of genius came from Martha, who'd apparently been plotting while we strategized. "We need media pressure," she said, phone already in hand. "My former student Sarah Chen works for the regional paper. She's been hunting for a corruption story." Martha's eyes twinkled with mischievous intelligence. "What if we gave her an exclusive about a 150-year-old land grant that could collapse an entire development built on stolen land?" The afternoon brought a parade of experts to my property. A land surveyor who looked like he'd stepped off a movie set, complete with weather-beaten hat and boots that had walked serious miles. A geological consultant who took soil samples and muttered about significant mineral indicators. An environmental attorney who confirmed my territorial water rights superseded any modern municipal restrictions. Each expert delivered the same message. If these documents were authentic, I owned development rights to most of Millbrook Valley, including subsurface mineral extraction. During our Chinese takeout strategy session that evening, Eleanor laid out our timeline. Phase 1, establish legal ownership through quiet title, 2 weeks maximum. Phase 2, document harassment pattern and file federal civil rights violations, coordinated with Chief Gonzalez's investigation. Phase 3, negotiate from absolute power. "What about the Thornwick family?" I asked, tasting sweet and sour pork mixed with anticipation. Eleanor's smile could have powered the entire valley. "Phase 3 is where we offer them a choice. Negotiate reasonable compensation for 150 years of illegal occupation, or explain to a federal judge why they've been running a conspiracy to violate constitutional property rights." Bob raised his beer toward the ceiling. "To David and Goliath, except this time David's got lawyers, evidence, and mineral rights worth more than Goliath's entire net worth." As everyone headed home, I stood on my porch breathing cool evening air scented with honeysuckle and the lingering aroma of victory planning. Tomorrow we'd stop playing defense and start crushing the opposition. Monday morning brought the sweet sound of revenge in motion, followed immediately by Delilah's desperate counterattack that made a toddler's tantrum look sophisticated. I was reviewing survey maps over coffee when the first explosion of diesel exhaust announced unwelcome visitors. A Thornwick construction crew had returned to my access road, this time with a backhoe that looked like it could relocate the Rocky Mountains. They weren't just repairing anymore. They were conducting full-scale demolition. "Road maintenance," Dean Thornwick called out when I approached, his hard hat reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of premium-grade bullshit. "County contract. This access road doesn't meet current safety standards." I watched them tear up gravel that had been perfectly fine since Ulysses S. Grant was president, creating ruts deep enough to hide a Volkswagen. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with churned earth and my own rising anger created an aroma that screamed economic warfare. "Funny timing," I said, phone already recording. "Day after I file legal papers establishing ownership of half the valley." Dean's smile had all the warmth of a morgue freezer. "Pure coincidence. Should be fixed by, couple weeks maybe, weather permitting." 2 hours later, my septic system backed up with the enthusiasm of a broken dam. The emergency plumber, one of the few contractors not terrified of Thornwick retaliation, found something that made him curse in 3 languages. "Someone stuffed a bunch of rags down your cleanout," he said, pulling out what looked like an entire wardrobe. This was intentional sabotage, no question about it. The repair bill, $4,000. The message, "We can make your life hell in ways you haven't imagined yet." That afternoon brought a parade of official harassment that would have impressed Stalin's secret police. State environmental inspector checking for chemical contamination. Fire department safety officer investigating structural hazards. County health department official documenting sanitation concerns. Even some poor bastard from the agriculture department checking for unpermitted livestock operations. I didn't own any livestock unless you counted the family of raccoons that had adopted my garbage cans. Each inspector arrived with suspicious timing, identical vague, anonymous complaints, and barely concealed disappointment when they found nothing wrong. The sound of clipboards scraping against citation forms became the soundtrack of bureaucratic persecution. "This is military-level coordination," Eleanor said when I called after Inspector Number 6 left empty-handed. "They're carpet bombing you with regulatory harassment, hoping something explodes in their favor. Or hoping I'll crack under pressure and take their money. Wrong target. I've been watching you operate, Marcus. You're the kind of stubborn that gets historical monuments built." That evening, while I was grilling a burger and pretending my life wasn't under siege, I spotted movement in my tree line. Security cameras don't lie, and mine showed 3 figures in dark clothing moving through my woods like discount ninjas having their first stealth lesson. I grabbed my brightest flashlight and walked toward them, making enough noise to announce my presence to half the county. "Evening, folks. Beautiful night for felony trespassing, isn't it?" The sound of bodies crashing through underbrush was like listening to a bear having a nervous breakdown. I found their abandoned supplies, spray paint cans, what looked like sugar for my gas tank, and a professional camera with telephoto lens that probably cost more than my truck. But here's where their desperation really showed. Bradley Thornwick's wallet, complete with driver's license, credit cards, and a membership card to some exclusive country club I couldn't pronounce. "Amateur hour," I said to the darkness, pocketing evidence that would make Chief Gonzalez very happy. Tuesday brought the bribery attempt I'd been anticipating like Christmas morning. Dean Thornwick arrived wearing his Sunday best and carrying a briefcase that suggested we were about to discuss serious money. "Marcus, let's be reasonable men here," he said, settling into my kitchen chair like we were discussing last night's ball game. "You've proven your point. You're a fighter. We respect that tremendously." He opened the briefcase with theatrical flair, revealing more cash than I'd seen since my divorce settlement. Neat stacks of hundreds that smelled like desperation marinated in old leather and broken dreams. $200,000, cash, for you to walk away quietly. Keep your dignity, start fresh somewhere that appreciates your talents. I stared at that money, enough to buy a nice house, new truck, maybe a vacation somewhere that didn't involve lawyers and property disputes. For exactly 10 seconds, it was genuinely tempting. Then I remembered the 8 families they'd driven out before me. "Generous offer," I said carefully. "What makes you think this property is worth that kind of money?" His smile flickered like a dying neon sign. "Just trying to avoid unnecessary conflict." I pulled out my phone and hit record. Dean, if this cabin and 15 acres are only worth $47,000 at auction, why are you offering 200 grand to make me disappear? The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly. You know about the territorial land grant and mineral rights, don't you? Dean snapped the briefcase shut like he was slamming a coffin lid. You're making a catastrophic mistake, Holloway. My family has connections at every level of government. We could make your life very, very complicated. Funny thing about threats, I said, walking him to the door. They sound a lot less scary when you're recording them for federal investigators. As his truck disappeared down my deliberately destroyed road, I stood there breathing evening air that tasted like victory seasoned with the perfect amount of danger. Phase 2 was about to get beautifully messy. Wednesday brought psychological warfare that would have made Sun Tzu take notes. I woke up to find dead animals scattered across my front porch like some twisted offering to the gods of intimidation. 3 rabbits, a possum, and what looked like someone's pet cat, all arranged with the kind of theatrical precision that screamed, "We're completely unhinged now." The smell hit me before I saw them. Death mixed with morning dew, and the lingering scent of whoever had handled the bodies. My coffee suddenly tasted like ash and regret. But here's the thing about bullies. They always overplay their hand. These idiots had left tire tracks in my soft garden soil, clear as fingerprints. The tread pattern matched Bradley's BMW perfectly, because apparently criminal masterminds don't understand evidence preservation. I called Chief Gonzalez before touching anything. "Chief, it's Marcus. I need you to see something that's going to make your day very interesting." 20 minutes later, she stood on my porch with a camera and an expression that could melt steel. "Jesus Christ, Marcus. They're escalating to animal cruelty and psychological terrorism." Gets better. Check out the tire tracks by my garden. She photographed everything with the methodical precision of someone building a federal case. This pushes us into felony territory. Harassment, intimidation, probably conspiracy charges. How long before we can move on them? Soon. FBI field office is very interested in your case. Small town corruption with civil rights violations. That's their bread and butter. That afternoon, my ex-wife called. I hadn't heard from Jennifer in 6 months, not since the divorce papers were signed and she'd moved to Phoenix with her yoga instructor boyfriend. "Marcus, I got a very strange phone call today," she said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of barely controlled panic. "Some woman named Delilah claimed you're involved in illegal activities. She wants to restart our divorce proceedings. Have you declared mentally unstable?" My blood pressure spiked like a rocket launch. "She contacted you directly?" "Called my office, talked to my secretary, even mentioned where I live now. Marcus, I'm scared. How did she get my information?" The implications hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. They were going after my ex-wife, 3 states away, which meant this had escalated beyond local harassment into interstate stalking, federal crime territory. "Jennifer, I need you to document everything. Times, dates, what she said exactly. And maybe call the Phoenix police." "What the hell did you get yourself into?" "I bought a cabin and restored it. Apparently that's a capital offense in Millbrook Valley." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at walls that suddenly felt less like home and more like a target. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my windows carried dust motes that danced like my scattered thoughts. That evening brought the final escalation I should have seen coming. I was grilling dinner when I smelled something that didn't belong, gasoline mixed with the evening breeze. My security cameras showed a figure in dark clothing creeping around my workshop, carrying what looked like a gas can and rags. Arson. They were actually going to try burning me out. I grabbed my phone, called 911, then stepped onto my back porch with my brightest flashlight. "I can see you, asshole! Fire department's already on the way!" The figure dropped the gas can and ran, but not before my motion-activated cameras got clear footage. Even in dark clothing and a baseball cap, I recognized that awkward, entitled gait. Bradley Thornwick was having the worst week of his privileged life. The volunteer fire department arrived first, followed by Chief Gonzalez and 2 state police investigators who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime drama. The scene had all the drama of a movie set, complete with floodlights and yellow tape. "Attempted arson," Chief Gonzalez said, examining the abandoned gas can. "Plus, the fingerprints on this container are going to make someone's day very complicated." One of the state investigators, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Sarah Mills, reviewed my security footage on her tablet. "Clear intent, clear identification, clear federal jurisdiction. We've got enough for arrest warrants." How many charges are we talking about? I asked. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, harassment, stalking, attempted arson, animal cruelty, destruction of property. She looked up with satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. Your local bullies just graduated to federal criminals. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer and my phone, watching news footage of Bradley Thornwick being arrested at his mother's house. The perp walk was everything I'd dreamed of. Handcuffs, flashing lights, and Delilah screaming about family connections while her precious son was stuffed into a police car. The local news reporter, a young woman with serious ambition, stood in front of the Thornwick mansion delivering lines that sounded like poetry. What began as a property dispute has exploded into a federal investigation involving corruption, conspiracy, and attempted arson. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Federal judge signed restraining order. No Thornwick family member can come within 500 yards of your property. Game over. I raised my beer to the night sky, breathing in air that finally smelled like freedom instead of diesel exhaust and threats. Tomorrow would bring the public reckoning I'd been planning for weeks. Thursday evening's emergency town hall meeting packed the Millbrook Valley Community Center like a heavyweight championship fight, except the stakes were higher and the crowd hungrier for blood. 300 residents crammed into a space designed for half that number, with regional media crews setting up cameras and state representatives arriving in black sedans that screamed political damage control. The air buzzed with tension thick enough to slice and serve on crackers. Sheriff's deputies flanked the entrances after yesterday's arrests, and I could smell the mixture of nervous sweat, industrial coffee, and the ozone scent that precedes electrical storms, both meteorological and political. Delilah sat in the front row looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight, flanked by lawyers expensive enough to buy small countries. Her usual country club perfection had cracked, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. Ladies and gentlemen, announced County Commissioner Williams, a man who looked like he'd rather be getting dental surgery without anesthesia, we're here to address recent developments regarding property disputes in our community. Recent developments, like her son being arrested for attempted arson, was just a minor scheduling conflict. Delilah shot to her feet before he finished speaking. This is a travesty of justice. My family has been pillars of this community for generations, and we're being persecuted by some drifter who bought stolen property. The crowd murmured like a disturbed beehive. I stood up from my seat in the back, feeling every eye in the room turned toward me like spotlights. Stolen property, I said, walking down the center aisle with Eleanor beside me, both of us carrying briefcases that contained enough legal ammunition to level a small city. That's an interesting choice of words. This is highly irregular, one of Delilah's lawyers protested. This meeting wasn't called to relitigate property ownership. Judge Patricia Harrison, who'd driven down from the state capitol specifically for this circus, adjusted her glasses with the authority of someone who'd seen every type of legal bullshit imaginable. Actually, given the federal investigation and criminal charges filed yesterday, I think we should hear what Mr. Holloway has to say. Eleanor opened her briefcase with theatrical precision. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to present some historical documents that shed new light on this situation. She pulled out the authenticated territorial land grant, holding it up like the Declaration of Independence. The room went silent except for camera shutters clicking like mechanical insects. This is the original 1873 territorial land grant for 50 acres in Millbrook Valley, issued to Ezekiel Holloway, Mr. Marcus Holloway's great-great-grandfather. It includes mineral rights, water rights, and timber rights in perpetuity. The silence was so complete you could hear dust settling on the windowsills. Dr. Moore stepped forward with her authentication equipment. The State Historical Society has verified these documents as authentic. Paper composition, ink analysis, seal verification. Everything confirms this is a genuine territorial period land grant. That's impossible, Delilah whispered, but her voice carried in the dead silence like a confession. Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of a prosecutor delivering a knockout punch. According to this grant, the Thornwick family has been illegally occupying Mr. Holloway's ancestral property for over a century. Every house in your development, every lot you've sold, every property tax you've collected, all of it sits on land that legally belongs to the Holloway family. The room exploded. Residents shouting questions, reporters shoving microphones forward, and Delilah's lawyers frantically whispering damage control strategies that were about 50 years too late. Furthermore, Eleanor continued over the chaos, geological surveys commissioned by Mr. Holloway indicate significant mineral deposits on the property. Natural gas, possibly rare earth elements. We're talking about potential wealth in the tens of millions. That's when Delilah completely lost it. "This is fraud!" she screamed, pointing at me like I'd personally insulted her ancestors. "He's a con man, a criminal. My family built this community." "Your family," I said quietly, and somehow my voice carried over her hysteria, "built this community on stolen land. And when I showed up with legal ownership, you tried to destroy my life, corrupt public officials, and eventually commit arson to cover it up." Chief Gonzalez stepped forward with a folder thick as a phone book. "Mrs. Thornwick, I'm also here to announce that the FBI has opened a federal investigation into conspiracy to violate civil rights, official corruption, and organized harassment. Your son Bradley has been charged with attempted arson, and we have warrants for your husband's arrest on corruption charges." The judge banged her gavel like she was driving fence posts. "Order! Mrs. Thornwick, you and your legal team need to understand that this territorial land grant supersedes any modern property claims. Mr. Holloway is the legal owner of the disputed property." Delilah collapsed into her chair like someone had cut her strings, the fight finally draining out of her along with her family's century-long grip on Millbrook Valley. "In addition," the judge continued, "given the pattern of harassment and intimidation documented by law enforcement, I'm issuing a permanent restraining order. No member of the Thornwick family may approach Mr. Holloway or his property." As the crowd filed out, buzzing with shock and vindication, I stood there breathing air that finally tasted like justice served with a side of sweet, sweet revenge. 6 months later, I stood on the restored porch of my cabin, watching the first annual Millbrook Valley Heritage Festival unfold across the meadow where Delilah's McMansion development used to cast its ugly shadow. The Thornwick family had accepted a plea deal that read like poetic justice. Dean got 2 years for corruption and conspiracy. Bradley received probation and community service, specifically 500 hours helping restore historical properties. Delilah herself faced federal civil rights charges and agreed to sell their construction company to pay restitution to the 8 families they'd driven out over the years. But the real victory was watching my community heal. Martha Caldwell had organized the Heritage Festival with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd waited 70 years to celebrate authentic local history instead of manufactured country club nonsense. The air filled with the sounds of bluegrass music, children laughing, and the sizzle of Bob Kettering's famous barbecue that smelled like heaven seasoned with redemption. "Not bad for a guy who just wanted to restore a cabin," Eleanor said, joining me on the porch with 2 beers that sweated in the June humidity. She'd become more than my lawyer. She was family now, along with Bob, Martha, and Chief Gonzalez, who'd been promoted to county sheriff after the corruption investigation cleaned house. The cabin itself had become something magical. With the mineral rights lease money, turned out those gas deposits were worth about $12 million. I'd completed the restoration to museum quality while adding modern conveniences that would make Ezekiel Holloway proud. Every beam told a story, every room breathed history, and the whole place hummed with the satisfaction of justice served cold. "You know what the best part is?" I asked Eleanor, watching families explore the heritage center we'd built in the old barn. "Those kids are learning real history. Not some sanitized country club version, but the actual story of ordinary people building extraordinary things." The Heritage Center had become a regional attraction, drawing visitors from 3 states to see authentic 1870s craftsmanship and learn about territorial period settlement. The educational programs funded college scholarships for local students studying trades, history, or law, because every community needs people who understand both building things and protecting rights. Sarah Chen, the journalist who'd broken the corruption story, had moved to Millbrook Valley permanently after falling in love with both the story and the storyteller. She stood near the Heritage Garden interviewing visitors for her upcoming book about small-town corruption and the power of ordinary citizens to fight back. "Marcus," called Bob from his barbecue station, waving a spatula like a conductor's baton. "Get down here and tell these folks about finding those documents." I walked down into the crowd, the wooden steps creaking under my boots, a sound that still made me smile after months of hearing it. The festival visitors gathered around, faces bright with curiosity and the universal love of a good David versus Goliath story. "Well," I began, falling into the rhythm of a tale I'd told dozens of times but never got tired of sharing. "Sometimes when you're just trying to fix a sagging floor, you end up changing everything." As I recounted the basement discovery, the legal battles, and the federal investigation that followed, I watched faces light up with the recognition that ordinary people could still win against corrupt systems. These weren't just entertainment stories. They were instruction manuals for anyone facing similar battles. The afternoon sun slanted through the oak trees Ezekiel Holloway had probably climbed as a boy, casting shadows that danced across soil that had finally returned to its rightful family. The scent of barbecue smoke mixed with honeysuckle and the distant sound of children playing where intimidation and threats had once poisoned the air. Later that evening, after the last visitor had gone home and the cleanup was finished, I sat on my porch with Sarah, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance above the meadow. "Any regrets?" she asked, her hand finding mine in the comfortable darkness. I thought about it seriously. The stress, the threats, the months of legal battles that had aged me years and weeks. Then I looked at my restored cabin, thought about the families getting justice and the community healing, and felt the weight of documents that had waited 150 years for the right descendant to find them. "Not a single one," I said. "Sometimes fighting for what's right is the only choice that lets you sleep at night." Now, if you've got your own HOA nightmare story, drop it in the comments below. Because bullies only win when good people stay quiet. And hit that subscribe button for more stories about ordinary folks who refused to back down when corruption came knocking. Trust me, there are plenty more where this came from.